My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. All right. Well, we've been examining Paul's language of putting off the old, putting on the new. I've been sharing with you how in all of Paul's other discussions of putting off corruption, putting on the new man, that none of those discussions, even though they discuss resurrection, they are not focused on biological death. And I've shown that even in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, that Paul uses the subjunctive to encourage his audience to put on that new man, to put on the image of the heavenly. Okay, now we begin an investigation, a thematic investigation of what Paul said. When the mortal has put on immortality, when the corruptible has put on incorruptibility, then shall be brought to pass the saying, death is swallowed up in victory. Now, Paul here reveals for us the source of his resurrection doctrine. And that source was the Old Testament. It was God's promises made to Old Covenant Israel. Many of you may not really catch the power of that incredible fact. But let me share something with you very quickly. All three futurist views, postmillennialism, amillennialism, dispensationalism, or premillennialism, believes that the resurrection takes place at the end of the current Christian age. When the new covenant age comes to an end, when God's promises to the church are fulfilled. Now, dispensationalism would decry that, and yet they still believe that the second coming is at the end of the Christian age. Here's a problem. God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, inclusive of the resurrection doctrine, that doctrine, that promise, those prophecies were made to Old Covenant Israel, Israel after the flesh. Paul in Romans chapter 8 spoke of the coming redemption of creation. And Paul said that he and his audience were eagerly awaiting the redemption of the body, or the adoption, to wit, the redemption of the body. What were they waiting on? The adoption. In Romans 9, 1-3, Paul says, Brethren, I testify, I could wish that I myself were accursed for my brethren, my kinsmen, according Israel, my kinsmen, according to the flesh, to whom belongs the adoption. Do you catch that? Paul said the adoption, which is the resurrection, which is the redemption of the body, that promise belonged to Israel after the flesh. Look, there's no way to overemphasize this point. Because if the adoption, the redemption, belonged to Israel after the flesh, I want you to follow me very, very carefully here. Not if, but since the adoption, the promise of the resurrection, belonged to Israel after the flesh, then we have very limited choices here. Point number one, the resurrection had to be fulfilled to Israel, for Israel, while Israel after the flesh, as God's covenant people, the people to whom those promises were made, still existed. So let me ask you a question. If you're an amillennialist, and if you're a postmillennialist, do you believe that Old Covenant Israel, Israel after the flesh, remains as God's covenant people today? Well, about 99.9% of all amillennialists and postmillennialists would say, no. Old Covenant Israel after the flesh does not exist as God's covenant people today. Okay, then one of two things. Number one, God's resurrection promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh as his covenant people have been fulfilled. Or, number two, God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh as God's covenant people failed. Now, Paul says, speaking of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, Paul said those promises were irrevocable. They were not breakable. So if God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh were unbreakable and irrevocable, if they were not going to be ripped away from Israel and given to the church instead, if God was not going to revoke those promises to Israel and give them to the church instead, and Paul said that's not possible, then that means that God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, the promise of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15, had to be fulfilled while Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, as God's covenant people, it still existed. And let me say this unequivocally, with no animosity whatsoever. It's just simply a biblical fact. Israel after the flesh, as God's covenant people, does not exist today. So let me reiterate. The promise of the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15 was an Old Covenant promise made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, as God's covenant people. That promise of the resurrection, therefore, had to be fulfilled while Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, as God's covenant people, existed. Since it is true that Israel after the flesh, God's Old Covenant people, does not exist today, then 1 Corinthians 15 is fulfilled, or God's promises, God's irrevocable, unbreakable promise to Israel after the flesh, as God's covenant people. Those promises failed, or they were fulfilled. But you see, our God is a promise-keeping God. He did not fail Israel. He did not break his promises to Israel. He did not postpone his promises to Israel. He did not take them away from Israel. He fulfilled his promises. Folks, let me urge you again, get a copy of my brand new book, One Root, One Kingdom, All Nations. This book demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel after the flesh, as God's covenant people, all of those promises stand fulfilled. He did not take those promises away from Israel. He did not replace Israel, setting them aside as a failure. He fulfilled all of his promises. And that means 1 Corinthians 15 is fulfilled. In the meantime, Lord willing, I'll see you on the flip side.